Are we gonna get a new first half?
Can I get your pen? Because there are some typos in the script, which is not good, because I will probably read it directly. It says...
Hey, Mike. Can you ask everyone in there if we'll get a new first half of the script? That was the second half.
Yeah, we don't have the first half.
We have the second half. Yeah.
Maybe I threw it out.
No, because I would have too, right?
Yeah, I'm confused, actually.
We have the second half. Is the first
there are
half?
no page numbers on these.
Yeah, mine does.
24, but it's all 24.
Oh, on the second half. Pagination. I love a good pagination in the afternoon.
Can we have someone print out new scripts because we don't have the first half in here?
They said this old first half is the first half.
I don't know. I think I
Is that right?
I think I threw mine out.
Oh, fuck. I'm getting rid of...
I assumed we were getting a new one.
Yeah, I
they
thought
weren't...
we were getting a fresh first. And do they cue us on Outtakes?
Hannah has a first half script, but they weren't complete, so I threw mine out.
Yeah, I'd love a complete...
Yeah. If we could get a complete script up in here.
Cáceres. This is second.
Yeah. What? I guess I was a little bit too eager.
It's okay. You live and you learn. You win and you lose.
We need these rundowns? Probably not.
So when it comes to the outro, we just say it, or do we wait for Becky's cue?
Becky, I think, will point at us to outro us.
Becky?
Right?
Can you hear me?
Or we could...
For what specifically are you guys talking about?
For everything. Like... Oh, just kidding. No, for commentary, you'll point to her.
I'm going to point to you for everything.
Great.
Okay, great.
Cool.
If you're not sure if mics are on, then just assume they're on. In case I fuck up and forget to tell you that they're off.
Okay.
By the way, you guys can see, which is me have known, and if you can me, you guys can see that they're on.
Yes, we can.
Where?
How? Where? Oh shit! That's why I pooped before the broadcast.
I didn't have to before.
I know.
I think the mics.
I don't think you have time now.
No, it's fine.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I think we can see when we are off because of this. I think when Mike pushes this button, my mic will go off.
What?
Yes, look at that. Perfect. Yours is, I think, the one
it's right
in the left-hand corner. No, yours is over there. The one that's flashing.
Oh.
Look at that little fancy trick. He was just flashing the
that
mic at you.
trick. Do you want one of these?
Yeah, it's cool. For sure.
God, I just feel so disorganized.
Yeah, I do too.
So we don't really come in
Until
I'm Meg Dalton.
yeah. Well, because there's Billboard, which is pre-recorded,
Mm-hmm.
and then
You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's May 5th, and I'm Hannah Long-Higgins.
And I'm Meg Dalton. President Trump returned to New York yesterday to a hearty welcome from protesters.
You will never, ever be welcome. Anytime he's in New York, I'm going there to show him that you are not welcome.
With cemeteries nearing capacity, some New Yorkers are rethinking cremation.
Nobody should tell us how we should dispose of our remains because it's such an intensely personal question for many people.
While most radio stations are focused on audience numbers and the bottom line, some are working to keep the community in community radio.
We have a woman doing a show called The Fitness Witch. And the concept of the show is like, how does your witchcraft feed your everyday life? And I'm like, that's such a great concept.
Also, a Jane Jacobs walkabout, the power of oysters, and citizenship at the Bronx Zoo. But first, these headlines.
NPR News in Washington, I'm Lori London. The next step for Republican efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act may prove to be a challenge. Thursday's House-passed health care legislation is likely to hit roadblocks in the Senate, where top Republicans are raising concerns about the bill's effect on the Medicaid program. NPR's Susan Davis has more.
The House bill changes Medicaid in two major ways. First, it phases out the Medicaid expansion allowed under the Affordable Care Act by 2020. It would also trim Medicaid by changing how the federal government reimburses states. The House bill would make states opt for either a lump sum or a per-person payment system instead of the current open-ended federal guarantee. It means states would get less money to cover costs. But the new system would reduce federal Medicaid spending by $880 billion over the next decade. These changes are expected to come under close scrutiny now that the bill is moved to the Senate. Leading negotiators like Maine Republican Susan Collins have voiced concerns that the reductions could limit health services for the neediest of Americans. Susan Davis, NPR News, Washington.
Sandbags are being piled on top of overflowing levees in the East Missouri town of West Alton. Heavy rainfall last weekend led to a sudden surge in rivers across several Midwestern states. Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson tells CNN the flooding in his state has been dramatic.
I did a flyover yesterday and saw much of the flooding region, and the water, thank goodness, is receding in many parts, but we've had broken levees. It's going to impact our farmlands, and we're going to have significant damage. We're going to be asking for a national declaration down the road, but right now it's all about recovery and saving property and lives.
10 deaths have been blamed on flooding so far, 6 in Missouri and 4 in Arkansas. Syria's main opposition group is criticizing a proposal to establish safe zones in the war-torn country, saying it's, quote, vague and illegitimate. But Russia, which helped broker the agreement with neighboring Iran and Turkey, is already talking about extending it. And as NPR's Lucian Kim reports from Moscow, the Russian military may also negotiate an agreement with the U.S. to avoid mid-air collisions in the region.
The Russian Defense Ministry says the agreement establishing safe zones in Syria will go into effect at midnight. The exact boundaries of the 4 zones will be determined by the beginning of June. The ministry said that the co-guarantors of the deal will be Turkey and Iran, but that the U.S., Israel, and Jordan were also involved in discussions. Moscow has been at odds with Washington after a U.S. missile strike on a Syrian airbase last month. Now the defense ministry says it may return to an agreement with the Pentagon on avoiding accidents involving U.S. and Russian warplanes over Syria. Lucian Kim, NPR News, Moscow.
On Wall Street, the Dow closing up 55. This is NPR.
In New York, I'm Sushmita Pathak. Manhattan and the Bronx are under a flood warning until 4:30 today. Heavy rains are causing problems for the already strained infrastructure at Penn Station. The main entrance to the station had to be shut down briefly, but is now open. 2 tracks of New Jersey transit system are currently closed due to flooding. Nicole Maliotakis officially announced this morning that she was running for New York City mayor. Maliotakis is a Republican New York Assembly member representing Staten Island and Brooklyn. In her first press conference as a mayoral candidate, she criticized Mayor de Blasio for his stance on crime.
This mayor's strategy of decriminalization and the hindrance of law enforcement have made all New Yorkers less safe. And the most basic of responsibilities, the most fundamental of mayoral duties, Bill de Blasio has failed.
The criticism comes just one day after the mayor announced with fanfare that last month was the safest April in New York City's history. At City Hall this afternoon, Mayor de Blasio gathered with New York congressional members to praise his administration's lobbying efforts in securing reimbursement for costs incurred for President Trump's security. The city will receive $68 million for securing Trump Tower during and after the election. This morning on the Brian Leary Show, de Blasio discussed the implications of the Republican healthcare bill for New York that passed the House yesterday.
It has a very direct human impact on over 1 million New York City residents who got health insurance under the Affordable Care Act.
The mayor says the bill would hurt New York's public hospitals and clinics and affect an already stretched public health budget. He was particularly critical of one part of the bill, the Collins Amendment, which he says is discriminatory towards New York City residents. It's 55 degrees in Central Park and raining. Sushmita Pathak, Columbia Radio News.
I'm Meg Dalton. You're listening to Uptown Radio.
And I'm Hannah Long-Higgins. Donald Trump is spending the rainy weekend at his golf club in New Jersey after a big day yesterday. Republicans in the House narrowly passed a health care bill that would replace Obamacare.
And in the evening, the president made his first appearance in New York since the election. As Alyssa Carcedes reports, some were thrilled to welcome the Queens native back to his hometown. Others, not so much.
Across the street from the Intrepid, the floating military and maritime museum on the Hudson River, a crowd holds up signs with Donald Trump's name. But they're not happy with Trump's return to his hometown. Security is tight, and hundreds of demonstrators are packed together, chanting shame. Marianne Obuli is one of them. She's a 62-year-old retiree, and she's making her feelings for Trump known.
I tell you, this man will never be welcomed in New York. Never, ever. He will never, ever be welcome. Anytime he's in New York, I'm going there to show him that you are not welcome.
And she's kept her promise so far. Obuli has been protesting for hours, following Trump around the city. She's a Nigerian American, and she doesn't like Trump's immigration stance, like the wall he's proposing on the Mexican border.
When Mexicans come here, or any other person come here, they just want to work, feed their family. Why can't we live and let live?
Being with other protesters is her way of standing up for her beliefs.
Because I can stay at home and go on the internet and then, converse with people. But I want to come out here and stand shoulder to shoulder with people, Americans, so that the world will see that not everybody is like Donald Trump.
Trump is pushing to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And that's one of the reasons 50-year-old Tanya Medding is here. She's near a booth selling rainbow-colored anti-Trump pins. She says she's a cancer survivor and is worried about affording insurance without Obamacare.
I think we would have a problem, and we would have very high premiums to pay.
A few feet away, Angela DiGregorio feels the same way. She's 32 years old and nervous about the future of healthcare for freelancers like her.
I'm insured now, but when my project is over, I won't have health insurance, and now I probably won't be able to get it.
She's holding up a brown sign with black painted letters.
It says, "You're taking away all the things that have made me proud to be an American."
Down the block, a small pocket of New Yorkers is proud of Trump. Ariel Cohane is wearing a yarmulke with a picture of Trump's face. He's holding a sign that says Jews for Trump in Hebrew. He says he likes Trump's pro-Israel approach.
It's not forcing them to give land for peace like President Obama did or Hillary Clinton would have done.
Cohane says it's not easy living in New York with his political leanings. By 10 p.m., crowds are dwindling, but still determined and still chanting. They're waiting for Trump to make his exit along the West Side Highway, but they're out of luck. A few minutes later, he leaves for his New Jersey golf club on a helicopter. For Nabuli, the 62-year-old from Nigeria, it was worth waiting all day.
This is like therapy, I'm telling you. I am so glad I came.
Trump is scheduled to stay in New Jersey for the next few days. And Nabuli says where he goes, she'll be there. Melissa Caceres, Columbia Radio News.
Congress is on recess now. The Senate will come back to a fresh bout in the fight to repeal the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, For a breakdown on what's in store for the House healthcare bill, we talked to political editor Joanne Kennan.
We know that Republicans tried and failed to pass a replacement a month ago. What was different about yesterday's bill, and who was won over?
Right. There were two big amendments. One amendment won over the Freedom Caucus, which is a very conservative faction within the House. It basically gave states the ability to waive out of a lot of ACA requirements. This is what you've been hearing about. Does it, in fact, protect people with pre-existing conditions? People with pre-existing conditions couldn't be denied insurance. You still have to cover them, but you could charge them a whole lot more. So the question is, are you really covering them? The other amendment, the second amendment, to put an extra $8 billion into these funds for the states that do the waivers, won over a lot of the moderates. To a layperson, $8 billion sounds like a lot of money. In terms of a $3 trillion healthcare system, $8 billion is not that much money. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, just said it's like buying a latte for healthcare. But it did get enough votes.
And I want to go back to the pre-existing conditions. You said insurance. You will still get insurance, but...
Well, you'll be offered it. The insurer can't say to you, you have cancer, I refuse to cover you. You could say, well, yeah, I'm going to cover you, but you healthy person, you can pay me $100 a month, and you sick person, you can pay me $2,000 a month. So legally, they have to say, yes, you can have it, but they can charge you what they want.
What will Senate Republicans refuse to budge on?
They're going to start from scratch. We're not sure if it gets through the Senate. If it does get through the Senate, that bill will look very different from the House. It'll probably be more moderate. The senators have expressed concern about some of the amendments that let states opt out of a lot of the Obamacare protections. I mean, they just think the House bill goes too far. It's going to take a few months to play out. It may look different a couple of months from now.
Figuring out a replacement for the Affordable Care Act, it's so complicated, it's so divided. I have to ask, is this the beginning of 8 years of Groundhog Day?
Well, the first 3 months were. I mean, do I expect to have an easy job where I can sleep in and walk out in the afternoon for a pedicure? No, I'm not going to be doing that. This is going to be an election issue. It'll be an election issue in 2018. It'll be an election issue in 2020. I think we can say it's going to be an election issue in 2022. It's complicated. It's expensive. It affects everybody, and that's one reason it's so hard to solve.
Joanne Kennan, executive editor for healthcare at Politico, thank you so much.
And thank you for having me.
You know the phenomenon. You're riding in the car or shopping at a store, and some song comes on that instantly takes you back.
Like how Livin' the Vida Loca always reminds me of that time I got lost on a family vacation.
Exactly. For years, scientists have tried to understand the way music affects the brain and to use it to treat people with diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's. I visited a hospital in New York City that's working to connect patients to their past through song. On the 6th floor of Bellevue Hospital, a man named Hugo wears an eye patch and lays on his hospital bed. He's 54, has a traumatic brain injury, and has been in this bed for a few days. His sister Margaret has been at his side for 3 to 4 hours each day since he arrived.
I was wondering how you were doing.
But slow down, that way words can come out.
The hospital room looks pretty typical. White walls, a birthday sign for Hugo. But what makes it different than a normal hospital room is the way it sounds. There's a small speaker pumping out Christian music in the corner of the room.
I was surprised when they offered an iPod. What hospital offers an iPod with music?
Patients like Hugo with a traumatic brain injury or TBI get the usual hospital essentials: a bed, dinner tray, hospital gown. But they also get an iPod and a personal playlist with 10 of their favorite songs. It's a new approach to treating patients recovering from TBIs and strokes. And it's part of a program called Music and Memory, which was originally founded to help patients with dementia and Alzheimer's. The goal is to help people remember who they are, and for patients with TBIs, to reduce agitation. Margaret says that for her brother, it seems to be working.
It relaxes him. It brings him to a peaceful stage, especially when we hear the old hymns. Like How Great Thou Art, soothes the soul.
Hugo and Margaret aren't their real names. I can't reveal patient names because of the hospital's strict confidentiality laws. Hugo likes Christian music, but all patients have different musical tastes. Once patients enter the unit, the staff finds out what kind of music they like. If the patient is unable to talk, the therapist makes some educated guesses. Irene David is the director of the Therapeutic Arts Department in Medicine for Adults at Bellevue Hospital. She scrolls through the department's iTunes library and matches each song with a different patient she's treated.
Very old,
She pauses when she scrolls past Klezmer.
From the old country, like think Anatevka from Fiddler on the Roof. It's typically a lot of wind, a lot of clarinets, fiddle.
The music library is constantly growing. Right now, there are 2,240 songs and a little something for everyone. The more Irene keeps scrolling, the more excited she gets. It's rare to see someone having this much fun in a hospital. There's Mozart and Beyonce and the Berry Sisters.
Just silly and uplifting, and it gets people moving. I mean, it's silly and adorable, and that's what you need when you're in a clinical atmosphere.
The actual iPods are stored in a separate part of the hallway, along with the patient's files. It's like a medicine cabinet, but for music. Instead of medical charts, there are files with notes on how each patient reacted to their songs on any given day.
Just a very simple fill-in grid, who's on it, patient for each line with their room number, time returned, and a very important column simply labeled patient response, e.g. facial expression, body language, signs of changed mood.
The Music and Memory program is at the forefront of this work, trying to explore how an impaired or injured brain can have such a strong reaction to music. Oliver Sacks was a famed brain scientist and champion of music and brain research. He once explained on an episode of Science Friday that it's almost impossible to lose music, even if the brain's language centers are knocked out.
Well, when music is played or imagined, many areas in the brain get activated. Some of them are hearing areas, but some are visual areas, some are motor areas, many are emotional areas. There's no one music center in the brain.
Essentially, when you listen to music, a dozen networks are lighting up all over the brain. Sacks died in 2015, but other brain scientists are carrying on with new research. Dr. Jonathan Burdett is a professor of radiology at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. His recent studies on music and the brain support the theory of the Music and Memory program. And he says that customized iPod playlists can help reduce the amount of medication patients of all kinds need to take. Less medication means less money.
It's cheap. How much is it? I mean, it's not a drug, for God's sake. It's music, and people have a connection with it.
He says the Music and Memory program is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to personalized music in clinical settings. While some critics may say it's too touchy-feely, Dr. Burdett says a day will come when patients of all kinds get iPods at most hospitals when they walk in the door.
It's going to be the new normal, and it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's frowned upon, but it's kind of, maybe it seems a little bit odd at some places now. That is not going to be the case going down the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, I switched it, so yes.
Yeah. So we can hear it from the speakers.
Back at Bellevue Hospital, another patient is getting his iPod turned on. When Roger first came to the TBI unit in January, he was asking for Bob Marley. He spent most of his time in bed and wasn't able to hold a conversation. Today, he prefers salsa and merengue, and you can find him dancing and doing push-ups.
Catch you at a bad time. Can we talk to you for a minute?
Yes, ma'am.
Roger's music therapist connects a speaker to his iPod.
That music, I started listening to the Spanish side. And the one I'm listening to now means a lot to me.
Roger says songs like these make him ponder his love life, his family, and his childhood. And that's exactly what the program is trying to do. Help patients connect with their identity before they became patients. And as Irene David puts it, those moments of clarity make a world of difference.
So beautiful about any art form is that it helps to open a window or keep a window open And that's just something to treasure. And to know that you've been a part of that, to help move a patient an inch toward clarity out of the fog, is immensely gratifying.
Patients get an inch closer to feeling more like their old selves, one song at a time. Hannah Long-Higgins, Columbia Radio News.
Now, a story about supply and demand. And the people demand beer. Upstate New York was once the spot for hops, the plant that gives your favorite India Pale Ale its signature bitter bite.
Now, New York is attempting to take back the industry. The state is encouraging craft brewers to buy their hops from local farmers. This has meant a huge leap in the amount of hops grown in New York. But not all local brewers are on top of the hop train. Catherine Sullivan takes us from the farm to the pint.
First, let's talk supply side. I'm walking with Chuck Rhodes on his farm in Willette, a town in central New York, population 1,000.
This whole field has been tied since last Monday was the first day we started.
He bought this farm a few years ago.
Just drove up through here and I pictured it pretty much exactly like this. So I don't know if you call that a bad dream or a vision, I'm not sure.
We'll go with vision, or at least it's something to behold. This field has rows and rows of tall poles, like telephone poles, 17 acres of them. They'll grow vertically on strings tied to wires between the poles. In just a few months, hop vines will grow nearly 20 feet up the strings, creating thick walls of green. But for now, it's a field of bare poles, beautifully geometric, and a little confusing.
People would stop and they would ask, what are you doing? We said that we were planting beer trees.
And beer trees, or hops, are a fussy crop. This morning, a small team of workers is tying the more than 30,000 strings the hops will grow on. After that, each plant will have to be wrapped by hand onto the strings.
There's just so many little things, and I know that we were only just beginning to understand what we don't know yet. Like I like to say, everyone that knew anything about hops died in New York 100 years ago.
A century ago, New York was the largest producer of hops in the country, until they were wiped out by a mold, and then Prohibition hit. And soon, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho were growing all the hops, on farms 20 to 50 times bigger than Chuck's.
The hop cartel, if you will, in the Pacific Northwest controls the propagation of those plants, so we can't get them.
They really can't get them. Some of the most popular hop varieties are proprietary, owned by farms out west. Despite this, 4 years ago, New York State started giving incentives to brewers who source at least 20% of hops from local farmers. Which brings us to the demand side of this beer story. There are more than 100 breweries represented at the Tap New York Craft Beer Festival. It's at the foot of a muddy ski slope in the Catskill Mountains.
We also have fun here. It's essential to having a brewery.
Kristen Lyons owns Binghamton Brewing Company. She's also the chair of the New York State Brewers Association. She grew up in a rural upstate town and loves supporting local farms. She even buys most of her hops from Chuck Rhodes. But she says taste gets in the way of buying all local.
It's tough. You want to do it all in New York, but the really fancy ones, the ones that everybody wants, they're just not quite here yet.
For microbrewers, the beer, the one that's going to make your name, is often an IPA, which requires a lot of hops to make. West Coast farms are favorites in IPAs. They have tropical, fruity flavors consumers want. New York hops taste different. That's a problem for brewers who want to take advantage of the incentives New York has set up for homegrown hops. To be considered a farm brewer, the minimum amount of New York State hops brewers must use jumps from 20 to 60% by the end of the year and 90% by 2024.
Trying to create a market for things that's not there yet in New York State. It could be there, but right now I just couldn't sign up my brewery to be handcuffed like that.
Zach Pedley owns North Brewery in Endicott. He said he's going to use the best ingredients no matter where they come from.
A lot of people in New York State are stuck in this mentality of, well, if you buy it from New York State, it's got to be good. That's not true. There is a lot of bad beer in New York State.
Over on the other side of the Tap New York Festival, Otto Burkus at Strong Rope Brewery disagrees.
We want to make a New York beer, and in order to do that, we think it's important to use ingredients that are from here.
That means Strong Rope sources all their hops and grain from in-state. He invites me to come see them make the beer at their brewery in Brooklyn.
This is the boil kettle. Don't get too close because it's really hot, but this is we're almost at the end of a 90-minute boil.
Jason Saylor is the owner of Strong Rope. He's breaking up chunks of hops to pour into a cauldron of boiling green liquid that Otto is stirring with a ladle.
Hammer and hops.
The whole room smells earthy and savory. They're making a double IPA. Jason rejects the idea that you can't make a good IPA with New York hops.
I mean, I can give you a taste of my IPAs. I think that's a cop-out. You can make an IPA. You can make some good IPA. You just have to be willing to look and find the hops that work.
Jason takes me over to a freezer and shows me the variety of hops he's bought from New York farmers. They're dried and in pellets. He even has some from Chuck Rhodes.
Larger suppliers. He's got some good stuff.
Jason pours me a glass of his double IPA, and it's great. He's figured out how to make a beer he believes in.
We should know our food systems and where things come from and what goes into our beers and what goes into our food and what goes into all of this stuff.
Back on the supply side, up in Willette, Chuck Rhodes is hoping more brewers will start to think like Jason at Strong Rope. For now, he still has hops from last year that he hasn't sold. Too much supply, not enough demand. I ask him when he expects his farm to be profitable.
I don't know if anyone knows in New York yet how long that is. I could tell you on paper, I thought it was going to be 3 years, and I can tell you on paper now, it's not going to be. It's going to be a lot longer than that.
Still, Chuck has plans to continue to expand his hop fields, and he'll soon have a very direct market connection. His son is opening a brewery of his own. The name? Beer Tree. Catherine Sullivan, Columbia Radio News.
Every child dreams of what they want to be when they grow up. But as Acacia O'Connor learned recently, on the path to growing up, some of those dreams are left behind.
I'm from Syracuse. If you ask me, that's what I'll say. That's where I lived as a kid, where I went to school. But so much of my life is anchored a 2-hour drive east. There, in Troy, New York, tucked at a shady end of a row of modest homes, is my grandparents' house. The house is broad and pointed, all brick and maroon paint with white windows and curving U driveway. The back overlooks a steep slope down to the busy 4-lane road below. We have this long-standing family tradition about that hill. When you leave, the rest of us line up and back and wave while the departing drive off, honking. In a far upstairs bedroom, the traffic down the hill creates a quiet whoosh of white noise. I slept there a few weeks back when I went up for Easter. There's a peaceful feeling to this house I've felt almost nowhere else in my life. In the morning, sunlight dots the floor, striking my great-grandmother's wooden hope chest, a black and red Afghan draped over it. There are those comforting sounds, plates being moved around, voices speaking softly to one another, downstairs in the kitchen, the pages of the newspaper turning, the sounds of childhood that told me that grown-ups are here, taking care of things. But I'm a grown-up now, as I've become more aware recently. Over the last few years, I've struggled with what being grown-up means. What it means for me, a millennial without the traditional trappings of American adulthood, marriage, kids, a house. When it first became clear that moving into an old folks condo might be best for my grandparents, the thought of someone else living in their house made me sick with panic. So many of the important events in my life happened here. My brother, cousins, and I spent countless hours running shoeless in the plush grass around my grandmother's garden. At Thanksgiving, exiled to the kids' table, we'd loudly sing the SpongeBob theme song on repeat. More recently, there were hard moments, too, as adulthood encroached, frantically searching for jobs after college when I had no idea what the future held, a funeral we had there in the rain after my cousin Chris died, and lately witnessing my grandpa's Alzheimer's advancing. A few weeks ago, he asked me, "Where do you live again?" Someone asked me what I was afraid of in losing the house. It's more than just memories of childhood. It's a dream I had, an alternate version of my life where I was a matriarch like my grandma, presiding over family gatherings. It was having a place for family, which always felt indelibly tied to these bricks. But buying that house and making it home for the next generation was a dream, one that conflicted with my other dreams, living in New York City, writing, studying journalism, pursuing the very life that makes my grandparents proud. When I realized the two were irreconcilable, the path forward was obvious, but it hurt anyway. After Easter dinner, my brother drives me to catch the Greyhound bus back to my life in New York. I won't move to Troy. Instead, I'll call and visit and help pack. It doesn't feel like enough. I want to say, and that's okay, but it's not really. And that feels bleak, but growing up, I'm starting to realize that I can't have everything, but really I do have so much.
You'll find Acacia O'Connor listening to her grandparents' vintage Panasonic AM/FM radio in her Harlem apartment. The click of the tuner knob is extremely satisfying. You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
Welcome back. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Meg Dalton.
And I'm Hannah Long-Higgins. Coming up, with a little room in cemeteries, more New Yorkers consider cremation. And the city celebrates journalist and activist Jane Jacobs.
And oysters become a surprising sentinel for the New York harbor. But first, these headlines.
In New York, I'm Catherine Sullivan. Trump's nominee for Secretary of the Army, Mark Green, withdrew from consideration today, citing attacks against his character. Top Democrats are speaking out against the new health care reform bill that passed the House yesterday. It heads next to the Senate. The bill passed even while there were still outstanding questions about its impact on the budget. Sarah Sanders, White House press secretary standing in for Sean Spicer today, defended the bill, despite doubts that it won't make it through the Senate.
We look forward to seeing the Senate take up the bill in short order so that we can move even closer to giving the American people the health care system they deserve.
This morning's monthly jobs report showed the lowest unemployment rate in 10 years, adding hundreds of thousands of jobs to the economy. But critics still have concerns. Emily Dugdale explains what these numbers really mean.
After last month's weaker than expected numbers, the April jobs report beat expectations this morning. Wages increased by 2.5%, and there was a decrease in part-time workers who say they prefer full-time work. Experts say this signals the labor market is getting stronger. If you are looking for a job, industries with the best results include the hospitality sector, which added 55,000 jobs this month. Also showing strong gains, healthcare and manufacturing. In his weekly address, Trump took some credit for the results and promoted a pro-business agenda he promised would bring even more jobs.
And that is why under our plan, we are cutting the business tax rate all the way down to 15%, bringing thousands of new companies and millions of new jobs to our shores.
But critics still have doubts. While wages are up, the numbers don't take inflation into account, in which case new job numbers would remain flat. And Wall Street has yet to embrace the uptick in new jobs. Overall, stock market gains have been minimal. Emily Dugdale, Columbia Radio News.
A U.S. Navy SEAL has been killed in Somalia and 2 more wounded, the U.S. Africa Command confirmed today. This is the first U.S. service member death in Somalia since 1993. The soldiers were on a mission to advise the Somali military outside the capital of Mogadishu when gunmen affiliated with the terror group Al-Shabaab opened fire. This comes after an announcement by Africa Command last month that they will be conducting more such trainings in Somalia. Campaigning in the French elections ends tonight at midnight as voters head to the polls this Sunday. Centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron is leading the polls ahead of far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, but 1/5 of French voters still say they won't be voting for either candidate.
I'm Hannah Long-Higgins. This is Uptown Radio. Solar energy is hot right now in New York City. The number of applications for solar panel permits increased by 400% over the last 6 years. This is partly due to the significant drop in the cost of solar. As Emily Dugdale reports, that doesn't mean everyone who wants solar energy can afford it.
Yvette Leeper Bueno is showing me her home's energy meters.
Oh, no, you're good.
It's the typical basement setup. We walk downstairs, and on the left-hand wall are gray boxes with confusing dials.
This is actually the solar meter itself, and you can see all the kilowatts per hour. It's right here. I mean, I don't know how to read it too.
But she doesn't have to. Her monthly bills tell her that one of these boxes is saving her a lot of money. Libra Bueno and her husband say they were some of the first in Central Harlem to install solar energy panels on their renovated brownstone. Libra Bueno says it's something they always wanted to do.
We're so committed to this, and we want to have this house that is fully as efficient as it can be, but also one that doesn't have to rely on conventional means for energy.
In the past 6 years, New York City has built over 64,000 solar installations, everywhere from public schools to government buildings, providing nearly 800 megawatts, enough to power thousands of homes. Libra Bueno's system cost her over $40,000 to install, but since she installed her system 7 years ago, the cost of solar panels, the kind you use at home, is down 70%, making solar cheaper than ever. But not cheap enough for many. Like the residents of the Hamilton Co-op, a historically low-income apartment building in Windsor Terrace, Brooklyn.
Right away, they just said no. You know, the solar was some kind of futuristic thing, and we had too many things going on at the time.
That's Troy Martin, a co-op board member and resident. The first thing you notice about his neighborhood? Wide, flat rooftops, great for solar. But his building is old. There are concerns about more basic needs. Residents say there was no gas for months last year. And now there are complaints about a water leak in the garage. Martin estimates that with solar, his co-op could save at least 20% of its electricity bill and pay off its investment in solar panels in 4 years. But there's resistance.
How do you figure out a way to get people to solar when they have all of these other costs?
I feel like probably people in this building they would rather see other things, probably. Or do you think,
I think that they would be interested in solar, but currently we have projects that absolutely have to be done.
Which Martin says is too bad, because if you head upstairs a few floors, you'll see that the afternoon sun today is baking the rooftop.
Nice and bright.
Yeah. There's no buildings on her back.
Okay.
So it's pure unobstructed space. So, as soon as the sun's coming up, and all during the entire day until it goes down, we would be getting sun. So
Martin's mission for the past 5 years has been to get solar panels on this roof. Still, despite his efforts, there are no solar panels here. He even worked with a nonprofit called Solar One to map out a plan. He hoped the co-op could take advantage of state tax incentives for New Yorkers who buy solar, a tax credit equal to 25% of the cost of the system. But in order to get the credit, you need to earn a lot of money. Annika Wister-Jones helps residents of affordable housing go solar at Solar One.
A lot of the incentives for solar are based on having really great credit and getting tax incentives, but if you're low income, then you don't pay income taxes, so the tax incentives are kind of useless.
That means if you use solar, the state will give you money back. But if you don't earn enough to pay income taxes in the first place, you're out of luck.
And that's just so unfair.
But Benjamin Ho has a different take. He was the former lead energy economist on the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He says when it comes to low-income buildings and residents, he's not sure solar energy is the right way to go.
I worry about the price and the fact that if communities are investing this much money in these solar panels, they might not be spending money on other things that might be more important.
Like the leaky garage roof and lack of gas at the Hamilton Co-op last year. And despite flat, sunny roofs like the one at the Co-op, Ho is also skeptical about the effectiveness of solar in New York City.
Solar is especially useful in sunny places with lots of open space like Arizona, and it tends to be sort of more costly and less efficient in urban places where land is really expensive and you don't get as much sunlight.
The benefit of investing in solar energy, when the payoff is not immediate, can be hard to grasp. Ann Minnie, an elderly resident, is sitting on the stoop of the Co-op, resting on her walker and chatting with neighbors. She's lived in the building for almost 30 years. She says solar energy isn't at the top of her agenda.
What people are saying is it saves a lot of money on your electricity bill.
I really don't know anything about it, and I don't remember them talking about it.
Minnie says she's got other priorities.
I think more about the elevators, because I feel they're dangerous.
Cuomo says 50% of New York State energy will come from renewable sources like solar by 2030. But Minnie says the Co-op solar panels can wait a little longer. Emily Dugdale, Columbia Radio News.
New York is a human-made city of iron and concrete, but sometimes it's easy to forget that it's also a city of coastlines with water all around, which makes the city a rich habitat for marine life. Kamila Kudelska explores one species that used to be more of a central character, oysters.
Aisha Salgado and Kim Gomez walk down a metal ramp onto a small wooden floating dock on the coast of Governor's Island. The Manhattan skyline is behind them, but they're focusing on the water. Salgado kneels down and grabs a brown rope connected to the dock. Both girls begin pulling the rope. Attached to the rope are 3 black plastic shoe racks you would put in your closet to organize. But there are no shoes in these stacks.
Okay, so these are our oyster trays. In these trays we have these bags of mesh with oyster shells in them, and on the oyster shells we have larvae growing. And this is our eco dock, so we usually have them here once they're a few weeks old.
Salgado and Gomez are checking on the status of the larvae, or baby oysters growing on the hard surface of adult oyster shells. The larvae are being introduced to the estuary water. An estuary is where the river meets the sea. The water is more salty than fresh. A perfect habitat for oysters, says Salgado.
They get really strong because now that they're used to the estuary water, we can put them in any of our other oyster reef locations and they'll be able to survive the temperature, the water quality, and usually they get tougher against any diseases that are or can be in our waters.
Salgado and Gomez are both interns for the Billion Oyster Project. As you can guess from the name, the foundation's goal is to restore 1 billion oysters to the New York harbor. Today it seems crazy to reintroduce oysters to the city's grimy water, but just over 100 years ago, the situation was very different, says Brett Palerman of Wagner College. He teaches about the environmental history of New York City.
Before New York was a city, New York was probably the single greatest oyster habitat on the planet. By some estimates, something like half of the entire global population of oysters lived in New York Harbor in 1609.
Before the abundance of hot dogs or thin crust pizza in New York, there were oysters, and everyone ate them, the Lenape Native Americans, settlers, and eventually immigrants. But these oysters didn't look anything like what we're used to seeing on our dinner plates today, says Palerman.
A lot of early New York oysters were monsters. If you open these things up, you'd imagine the thing inside must have looked like a steak. It must have been a solid meal. This was not a bite of oyster that you tip back at the bar today.
New Yorkers prepared them in stews, threw them on a stovetop, grilled them, or just ate them raw. But one thing, one of the biggest populations of oysters in the world couldn't compete with? New York City.
And you can imagine, as the city population grew and as harvesting methods became more and more efficient, that humans grew pretty good at scraping this place clean. Even a tremendous oyster population like existed here could not keep up with the technology and the sheer growth of the size of New York City.
By 1927, the city closed the last bed of oysters, declaring them unsafe to eat, and ever since, New York oysters were virtually extinct. Today, at the Billion Oyster Project, they're working on creating a whole new population. Bliss Budraga is giving a tour of the hatchery at Governor's Island.
So I'm going to pull one of these guys out so you can get a chance to see this up close and personal.
The hatchery is one small square room. Cramped inside are 3 huge tanks filled with water. Budraga goes over to one tank. Inside are oyster shells held together in black mesh bags. The baby oysters are ready to become spat, essentially attached to a hard surface of an adult oyster shell.
Great. So they kind of look like poppy seeds right now, but all those black specks, those are baby oysters.
Next, Budraga goes over to a small glass fish aquarium. Inside, there are a couple of oyster shells. She puts her hand in the water and grabs a big oyster shell with tiny oyster shells attached to it.
Okay. So this is what spat on shell looks like.
On average, 20 oysters can attach to one shell.
On this one, we have about 5 guys hanging out on here. And they'll stay like this. So basically these guys will mature and spawn. They'll have their own babies. Hopefully their babies will spat around them. And that's how they really build those massive reefs.
One of the new trends of coastal resiliency is oyster reefs. They're clusters of oyster shells attached to each other, creating wall-like structures. Oyster reefs have a number of different ecosystem benefits. They're filter feeders, they provide habitats for fish, and they stabilize the water bed. But by far the most popular today, shoreline protection.
Basically, the older the oyster is and the older the reef is and the bigger it is, obviously the better it'll break those waves before they come to our shoreline.
New York City is an urban coastal city, And after Hurricane Sandy, city leaders realized they could no longer ignore the threat of future storms and rising sea levels. Until now, breakwaters were the norm for protection, but these rocks or artificial material placed in the water along the coast are not enough. Steven Cyphers is an assistant professor at Northeastern University. Back in 2011, he published a research paper showing that the presence of oyster reefs on the coast can reduce shoreline erosion.
We take the benefits of oysters and design oyster reefs that are comprised with the same characteristics of a breakwater. So you get this engineering shoreline protection outcome, but you also get the environmental benefits.
So, if oyster reefs are reintroduced along the coastlines, they can help weaken storm waves and preserve marshes and wetlands, while also creating a rich marine habitat. And in the not-too-distant future, New York City will be testing the efficiency of natural breakwaters. Last week, the city held a public hearing on living breakwaters, a proposed ecological breakwater system with oyster reefs along the south shore of Staten Island. Pippa Breischer is the project manager. She says the aim was to think of a new way to protect coastal cities.
We kind of set a couple questions out for ourselves. What if we can't always keep the water out? What are the real risks, the most damaging risks of coastal storms? And how can we work with nature and not against it?
Embracing nature, not fighting it. That's what interns Aisha Salgado and Kim Gomez are doing back on the dock at Governor's Island. They're lifting heavy stacks of 3 oyster trays back into the water. In another week, there will be a couple thousand more oysters reintroduced into the harbor. Some will create oyster reefs, and the Billion Oyster Project hopes to get to 1 billion oysters by 2035. New York may never return back to the rich oyster habitat it was over 400 years ago, but today, at least they're heading in the right direction, one baby oyster at a time. Kamila Kadalska, Columbia Radio News.
Cemeteries in the city will soon be at capacity as burial spaces are becoming few and far between. My co-host Meg Dalton discovers how the high demand of real estate is changing the way we lay our loved ones to rest.
Amy Cunningham stands before a small but attentive crowd in a cozy chapel at Greenwood Cemetery's crematory.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Cunningham.
Behind her, there's a beautiful glass wall sprinkled with multicolored leaves. And in the center of the room, where a casket usually goes, there's a flat-screen TV. She's here tonight not to preside over a funeral, but to give a presentation about the future of the funeral.
The funeral 20 years from now is going to be simpler, greener, more family-centered.
Cunningham is a funeral director in New York. Gone are the days of traditional casketed burial, she tells the audience. Instead, today's funerals are all about 3 things: natural burial, home funerals, and cremation.
Cremation is here to stay. It's not going away. And 2016 was the first year that cremation rates surpassed that of burial. That's a seismic shift in the way we manage death in this country.
Half a century ago, almost everyone who died in the U.S. was buried. Their grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents were all laid to rest, usually in a family plot. But in New York City, space is limited. There's only one active cemetery in Manhattan today, and others like Greenwood have maybe 10 years before their burial plots are gone. But it's not just a space issue. For decades, there's been waning interest in traditional burial. One reason? Price. The International Cemetery, Cremation, and Funeral Association says the average cost of a traditional burial is $7,500. Cremation, $1,500. So cemeteries have started adapting to consumer demand.
We got 17 miles of road.
David Eisen is giving me a tour of Woodlawn Cemetery's nearly 400 acres. He's the executive director of the famous Bronx Cemetery. Okay, so where are we driving to now?
We're going to go to our Brookside Cremation Garden first.
We pull up to a babbling brook. At first glance, it looks pretty ordinary. But it's actually the final resting place for some of the cemetery's residents.
You hear families quite frequently scattering maybe out in the park or out in the garden, or but once you do that, you can't retrieve those back.
Which is why families come here, to nestle cremated remains into rocks or blend them into the landscape. Their cremation garden is just one of several options for cremains at Woodlawn Cemetery. There's also a scatter garden, in-ground burial, cremation memorial, and mausoleums. It's had an on-site crematory since the 70s, but most of these options were added within the last 5 years. Consumer demand for cremation is at an all-time high, but it's not just the price tag that appeals. For some, it's become a way to keep their loved ones a bit closer to home, or quite literally in their homes.
This is my ritual room, my consulting room.
Donna Hines has a cabinet in her living room with urns containing pets, some friends, and her son Omar. She doesn't want to discuss the details of his death, but she says before he died, she made him a promise to keep him close by.
The big terracotta thing on the bottom, that's him. And the smaller things are parts of friends. I mean, some cremains were divided among good friends, and some of the smaller ones are dogs and cats and a rabbit.
One of those friends was Tim. Hines and his widow recently made the decision to cremate him. They kept the funeral simple, just like he would have wanted it.
And his casket was a cardboard container, and we covered it with a beautiful cloth. And on the cloth, I created an altar of things that were pictures of him, flowers, in his case, a joint for the trip.
That's right. Hines sent him off with a puff. She still isn't sure how she wants to go. Deciding what happens to your body after death can be a complicated and personal decision.
Nobody, the industry or the government, should tell us how we should dispose of our remains, because it's such an intensely personal and religious, or at least spiritual, question for many people.
Tanya Marsh teaches funeral and cemetery law at Wake Forest University. She says cremation wasn't even a possibility in the U.S. until the 1880s, when Dr. Francis Lemoyne opened the country's first crematory in Pennsylvania. He thought it would be a more sanitary way to dispose of bodies. This was a pretty radical idea at the time. The U.S. was heavily influenced by Anglican law at its founding, and that meant cremation was frowned upon, as it conflicted with the Christian belief in resurrection. The practice of cremation didn't gain traction until centuries later.
In the early 1960s, we still had a cremation rate in the United States that was about 5%, even though we'd had cremation for about 80 years on a very small scale.
Cremation has grown in popularity in the country, but some still don't like it. Dennis Paust is with the New York State Catholic Conference.
We're not crazy about cremation. We continue to believe that burial is the preferred method for Catholics. Now, that's not true for everybody, and we're not certainly fighting that as a public policy measure.
It's the same for other faiths like Judaism and Islam. Paust says if someone does choose cremation, the body should be treated with respect.
The remains, cremated remains, should be put in a worthy container. They should be buried if possible. They shouldn't be left on someone's mantle. They shouldn't be scattered in the wind and that kind of thing.
It could be 5 or 15 years before cemeteries run out of space here. People might have to get more comfortable with the idea of being cremated. Otherwise, they'll have to find a permanent residence outside of New York City. Meg Dalton, Columbia Radio News. The Bronx Zoo is well known for lions and tigers and bears, and tourists. Today, though, the zoo is also a place where some New York kids are becoming U.S. citizens. Pia Peterson spoke to some of the city's newest and most eager young Americans today at the zoo.
Marshall Valerie Francois is 10 years old. He and his mom, Marlene Jean Gilles, are walking right past the American bison enclosure in the Bronx Zoo, but they don't seem to notice the huge animals at all. Today, Marshall's got other things on his mind. I asked him how it feels.
Scary.
Why scary?
Don't be scary about that. 'Cause I'm nervous. This is my first time.
Marshall is being sworn in today as an American citizen, going through the same ceremony that his mom, Marlene, did last year, renouncing her Haitian citizenship.
I was so happy that day, January 8, 2016, last year. Yes, and after that, I applied for Marshall.
Kids who came to the States with their parents or were adopted from abroad can become American citizens as soon as their parents complete the lengthy citizenship process. Katie Tahasik is the New York Public Affairs Officer for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Her department works with visas and green cards. If someone in New York is getting good news about their immigration status, it's coming from her office. Today, 32 kids from 25 countries will receive a very important piece of paper.
Their certificate of citizenship. They have derived their citizenship from their parents. This is the moment they get the actual certificate that shows that and is proof of that for the rest of their lives.
The certificate looks like a cross between your high school diploma and the photo page of your passport. It's not just a token, it's evidence that they're an American. And psychologically, this is important to kids. Mahamadou Kamran's family is from Gambia, and his 3 younger siblings are getting their citizenship today.
My brother's sister is the one with the blue, the pink, and the other blue. The one in the middle right there. Yeah.
Kamran is 12 years old. Today seems like a weight off his shoulders. It's stressful for kids to worry about immigration status within their families, and he is very protective of his siblings.
That's important for them because they come and they're immigrants, and it is important for them not to get deported back, and it's important for them to get what they need and what they want.
Do you worry about that?
Yeah, I worry about my family, of course. Yeah, I have to worry about them.
Good morning, children, young men and
The kids rise to pledge their loyalty to the USA with the administration of allegiance, and then U.S. Congressman Jose Serrano leads them in a pledge. Kamran slinks off to join his dad and dozens of other parents, taking photos of the kids all dressed up for the occasion, waving tiny plastic flags and beaming.
Liberty and justice for all.
And with that, 32 kids rejoin their families as official Americans, with the one little piece of paper that makes a big difference. Pia Peterson, Columbia Radio News.
Yesterday would have been Jane Jacobs' 101st birthday. Jacobs was an author, a journalist, and most famously a community organizer who fought to preserve neighborhoods for people who live in them. This weekend, people in cities all over the world will remember her through Jane's walks. Max Haltman joined a tour through Chinatown.
It's not the perfect day for a neighborhood tour, but Christy Lau is getting ready to lead a Jane's Walk. Lau is a children's librarian at the Chatham Square Library in Chinatown.
She was a thinker, a writer. She critiqued the urban renewal policies of the 1950s because she believed that it destroyed communities. Instead, she advocated for density, for walkability, for mixed-use neighborhoods, because she believed that those were the elements that were crucial to creating a very livable city and a more vibrant community.
Chinatown, with its narrow streets and busy commercial rows, is the kind of neighborhood that Jane Jacobs described in her famous 1961 book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. In that book, Jacobs wrote about the sidewalk ballet, the eyes on the street of commercial buildings mixed with residential ones, the social capital of neighborhoods with longtime residents. Today, outside of a small shop, you might hear something like this. The hustle and bustle of the street. But it might sound a lot different today if not for Jane Jacobs. For more than a decade, Jacobs led the fight to stop construction of the Lower Manhattan Expressway, the LOMEX, part of city planner Robert Moses's urban renewal plans, a 10-lane elevated highway linking the Holland Tunnel to the Williamsburg and Manhattan bridges. There's no LOMEX today, but there is that social capital that Jacobs wrote about.
As these immigrants kind of started to cluster together in this area, they slowly expanded into what we now see as Chinatown. They created their own internal structure, they had their own government.
At the next stop on the tour, one of Chinatown's most famous street corners, at Doyer Street.
Law enforcement officials say more people have died violently at Bloody Angle, the crook at Doyer Street, than any other intersection in America.
That corner's a lot less violent nowadays, and many other things are different as well. Francisca Benitez is a neighborhood artist who works with the Chinatown Working Group to oppose rezoning in the neighborhood.
Right now
we have an influx of luxury skyscrapers in this neighborhood. And under the 1961 zoning resolution, we don't have much protection.
It's like almost, you can equate that to what the Lomics could have done here, you know, and this neighborhood is really fighting with their teeth this thing.
The battles that Jane Jacobs fought aren't just history. They're still being waged today. Whether it's protesting an expressway or luxury towers, Benitez says the memory of Jacobs' work is still an inspiration to Chinatown residents. Max Hauptman, Columbia Radio News.
That Chinatown tour is one of many Jane Jacobs tours being offered this weekend in neighborhoods throughout the world. Earlier, I spoke with Aaliyah Scanlon, the director of Jane's Walk, which organizes these tours. She said the tradition started with Jacobs herself.
One of Jane's most famous exhortations was, "You've got to get out and walk." And so every year on the first weekend in May, to celebrate her birthday, groups of people would get together in Toronto and go for a walk, walking conversations, walking tours of the places where they live. And we're not exactly certain how this happened, but the idea got picked up and just spread throughout the world in a really unexpected, grassroots way.
So tell us about Jane Jacobs for people who've never heard of her.
So she wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities that completely turned urban planning on its head.
Yeah, so how did it turn it on its head?
So Jane believed that you can't go about deciding what's good for a city or what's good for a neighborhood by looking at a bird's eye view plan. You have to get down into the streets and walk them to really understand what was happening there and how people were going about their daily lives.
What was the field of urban planning like before Jane Jacobs?
The field of urban planning was very much dictated almost entirely by credentialed men in suits who sat in rooms and made decisions based on what they thought cities should look like.
And it seems like Jacobs, has had a profound impact, but she's only famous in certain circles. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. She does tend to be kind of an icon in urban planning and architecture and urbanist circles. But in my work, I encountered a lot of people who actually don't know who Jane Jacobs was. And I think part of that might be because she herself kind of shunned the idea of being an icon.
What were the common critiques of Jane Jacobs, if there were any?
Jane Jacobs is often critiqued then and now. Now she's often critiqued as being a voice for NIMBYism, for not in my backyard, where we have citizen voices saying, no, I don't want that built near my home. There's critiques around her role in gentrification and displacement. All of those critiques and all of that is really wonderful. Jane didn't really believe that her ideas were canonical. She wanted us to continue talking about these issues and to continue discussing them as cities change.
That was Aaliyah Scanlon with Jane's Walk. Thank you so much, Aaliyah.
Thank you so much, Meg.
With relationships, you never know what goes on behind closed doors, as the saying goes. That's true even if you're a kid, living in the same house as your parents. As Kristen Schwab learned, love can look different than you think it should.
You might not be able to tell that I'm from the Midwest because I've lost the accent. I grew up in rural Minnesota where fields are peppered with corn and cows. On any given night, if you drove down the dusty dirt road past my house, you'd see the same scene. My parents' house has 2 identical picture windows, perfectly aligned on the ground and second floors. They'd be lit up from the glow of the TVs. My parents would be sitting across from them. Mom upstairs, Dad downstairs. They'd watch their shows separately, sometimes watching the same thing, shouting at the Chicago Bears game or Wheel of Fortune from their own couches. For some reason, I never thought this was odd. I grew up in a totally pleasant household. I rarely saw my parents fight. There was little drama, but also little passion. I saw love as a practical relationship. And it's not because the household was a super traditional one. It was a biracial marriage. My mom is from Korea and my dad is German. The breadwinner always flip-flopped. When I was little, I had a stay-at-home dad. I love all these parts of my parents' marriage. They were a great team. It was a relationship of high fives and handshakes. A little over a year ago, my dad, who is 75, had a severe stroke. I came home to a version of him I didn't think I would have to see for a long time. We had to physically help him do a lot. Walk down the stairs, put on his shoes, among other more intimate things. But that wasn't the hard part. It was his memory. He couldn't remember where he lived. Sometimes he couldn't remember my name. But for every difficult moment, I knew that at the end of the month, I would pack up and return to New York, and that my mom would have to continue helping him alone. When I went back to visit last summer, things had improved. Dad will never be back to his old self, but he was physically strong and mentally in great spirits. The biggest change? Mom and Dad had stopped shouting at the TV from separate rooms. They were solving Wheel of Fortune puzzles together, on the same couch, as Vanna White flipped the tiles. It was beautiful, but it also freaked me out, and it made me look at my own relationship. I realized I was living with a man I couldn't see myself taking care of in 40 years, or in 14 years, or even in 4 years. I'd been searching for love with a checklist. Treats me well, has a good job, likes art and reads the news. I wanted a sure bet, but I was unsure of what I was betting on. This was not great timing. I came back to New York to start grad school at Columbia University, and as the year began, I broke up with this marriage material boyfriend. I navigated the first 3 months of a stressful school year in total limbo. We slept in separate rooms in our Brooklyn apartment. We divvied up our friends and divvied up our stuff. Then, on October 31st, the movers came. I could tell they'd done these moves before, emptying half the contents of a one-bedroom apartment. Before taking the last load to the truck, one of the men stopped and said, "I'll give you a moment," and shut the door behind him. My mom always told me there are rules for relationships. Date somebody who loves you more than you love him. You can be more successful than your man, but always come home and cook him a nice dinner. Never date someone way older than you. I've followed this puzzling mix of relationship advice for 28 years. As I watch my friends get married and divorced, I'm finally realizing that there is probably no right formula, even though psychologists and mathematicians have tried to find one. Trust me, I've Googled. Maybe what I see in my parents' marriage and what they see are totally different. Maybe relationships aren't a choice between practical or passionate. Maybe there are no rules. And maybe a good marriage means there will be days when it's okay to watch TV from 2 separate couches.
One of Kristen Schwab's many career goals as a kid was to be the next Vanna White. In the age of the internet, independent radio is easier than ever to produce. And even though the internet reaches much farther than a transmitter, some local independent radio makers are working to keep the community in community radio. Rebecca Scott has more.
I'm walking with Sherry Barkley down Punk Alley, just beneath the Myrtle Broadway JMZ line in Bushwick. The alley is lined with shipping containers turned book and record vendors. At the very end of it, next to a brightly painted porta potty, is the shipping container that kpiss.fm calls home.
This is how every DJ does it. They get the code and they let themselves in.
The 10 by 10 foot room is stocked with a turntable, a microphone, and thousands of dollars worth of recording equipment. Sherry says everyone who uses the equipment follows an honor system.
I think I'm a pretty good judge of character because we've had over maybe over 1,000 people in here in the last 2 years, and everything has been perfect.
Perfect, but that's not how she found it 2 years ago.
It smelled like piss, and that's why the space was still available in such a highly coveted and affordable area. And someone even came in there and they said, "You're going to turn this into the radio station. Like, you're crazy. What are you going to call it? WPISS?"
Sherry decided the West Coast K sounded cooler. -1 urine-soaked carpet, plus a whole bunch of cleaning supplies, and a YouTube promo video later, and kpiss.fm was born. Now it's home to over 45 DJs and 55 shows, including Sherry's own show, Call Your Mom.
Hello?
Hello, how are you? I just want to know that you're okay.
Mom, I'm fine.
That's all. I miss you. Don't you miss me a little bit?
Of course, Mom, all the time.
For Sherry, radio is not meant to be a solitary passion. Whenever she's hosting a show at the studio, she tries to make eye contact with people passing by outside of the big front window. She calls it her weirdo to weirdo glance.
I was in here and I was playing Air Supply and doing like a deep dive into Air Supply. And this guy, Raul, looked in and I could tell, so I waved him inside, sat on the couch, and we both just, enjoyed Air Supply.
I'm all out of love. I'm so lost without you. I know you were right.
We have a woman doing a show called The Fitness Witch, and she's actually a witch, and she also has a fitness company. And the concept of the show is like, how does your witchcraft feed your everyday life? And I'm like, that's such a great concept.
That's Tom Tenney. Further down the JMC subway line is Radio Free Brooklyn. Radio Free Brooklyn is an independent internet radio station that Tom founded in the basement of a record store just 2 months before Sherry's K-Piss.
What we're doing right now here in the space that we're sitting in, if we had been doing this 20, 30 years ago, we would have a transmitter on the roof.
The setup is similar to kpiss.fm, minimally decorated with just enough space for the equipment and those who use it. And like Sherry, Tom is obsessed with the idea of independent radio as a community space.
People know now that there's something in the neighborhood that is relevant to them. And I feel like that feeling of community is kind of seeping out of American culture, and we want to kind of be a glue that reinforces it.
He says the internet has made it so much easier to legally produce independent radio, but he's nostalgic for the past.
Because one of the things I do think that's being lost is the aspect of discovery. People are only getting and listening to the things that they choose to get and listen to. And that, to me, is making us into a world of morons.
Discovery is the reason Tom doesn't allow his hosts to archive their shows until 5 days after it airs. He says if they did, nobody would listen live. And if nobody listens live, they'll never discover the last 5 minutes of the show that airs before it, or the first 5 of the following. Another aspect of internet radio Tom can't stand: the obsession with numbers.
We're such a numbers and data-driven culture right now. And, with pirate radio, you had a transmitter out there, and the idea was not how many people were listening. The idea was somebody was listening.
How many listeners do you guys usually get?
Millions. More than Howard Stern.
Back in Punk Alley, Sherry shares a similar disdain for the numbers, but that doesn't mean she isn't hustling to get the word out about K-Piss. To her, the radio station belongs to everyone in the neighborhood, and she makes it her mission to let everybody know it. Like this couple that she stopped outside of the studio.
What is it? What are the shows about?
There's 55.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So, there's a show about dating, there's a show about surfing. Okay. So, yeah, just all kinds of stuff. But yeah, please check it out. We're on Instagram too, so yeah.
K-Piss is Sherry's life. Literally. She doesn't have a day job, even though K-Piss only brings in $14,000 a year from monthly DJ contributions. This means skipping meals and never leaving her neighborhood, but it also means more time to hang around the studio spreading the good word about K-Piss. And when it comes to community, Sherry is confident that independent radio, like the grandfather of it all, WFMU, only attracts the good eggs.
If you were to meet another WFMU fan, I'm sorry, but there's 100% chance that person is not a serial killer. Maybe they haven't showered in 30 days or something, sure. But no, serial killers, because serial killers don't listen to Jonathan Richman.
This, perhaps, is the only rule at kpiss.fm. No serial killers allowed. Rebecca Scott, Columbia Radio News.
Okay, now you say bottom lovers. I got the AM. Got the car, got the AM. Got the AM sound. Got the rock and bottom neon sound. I got the car from Massachusetts.
And that's our show. We hope you enjoyed today's broadcast of Uptown Radio.
Our executive producer today was Devin Brisky. Our senior producer, Lindsay Cordica, worked with Emily Dugdale and Taylor Wisner.
Senior editor Acacia O'Connor and assistant editor Camila Kudelska led our copy team.
Director Becky Scott coordinated our studio production with Camila Kerwin and Mike Elson-Rooney.
Kristen Schwab and Sarah Gibson got this streamed live to the web.
Radio professors Carrie Donahue, Joe Richmond, Sally Hershups, and Osa Secker advised our staff. I'm Meg Dalton.
And I'm Hannah Long-Higgins. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. You can find more stories throughout the week on uptownradio.org. Thank you for listening to Uptown Radio. Tune in next week.